life taker artifact that was something we had to respond to right away once we became aware of the issue. It was doing an invalid damage type, and it was like going around all of our systems basically, negating shield blocking and all sorts of terrible things.
So I was the one that told him about this one.
Temporarily, but it will be turned back on for the 4.16 update.
Shout out to Crush, because he also figured that one out on the stream with me. For reference too, when this launched, this giant bug list here, some of these are red that we consider to be higher priority, but that list when we originally put the video was, I think, around 70. We ended up around 120. It still needs to be trimmed down a bit. Some of these are duplicates, but it has the ideas at least. And then we have this other one that we started putting together. It's a little bit easier to look at in terms of readability, and links are embedded with it. And both of those are still public facing. We're able to kind of use both of those to figure out stuff that is broken. So both those have been helpful, and appreciate everyone for putting time into those.
Where we talk about all things New World. This is an episode of Balance of Power. And
you and I literally tested this and took him over a day to disable it, Keck. Yeah, it probably should have been overnight.
That are going to be coming up in the
I don't know why it took that long.
Update. But before we get into the details, I wanted to start things off by just
at least they listened,
recognizing the community feedback we got on our last episode. We didn't have a lot to share that was new at the time, and going forward, we're going to actually only do this show when we do have new things to talk about, things that we really wanted to share with the community.
Yeah, so last time we talked about up and coming changes, and they didn't talk about the current changes at all to the current balance of where everything was, and that was just so annoying because it felt and it still feels like stuff is broken, and there needs to be actions taken now that are not just bug fixes, but in terms of class balance, and see how they do that here.
In mind, we have a full show ahead of us. We have lots of things to talk about. I just wanted to start out though by talking about the season 5 launch. I know we talked last time about our changes to the scripting system, and there were a lot of issues to come out of that, as expected. We are definitely looking at all these reports. We have.
I think AGS devs get a really hard rap, but they need to do better. Next 6 months will be crucial for New World.
Before season 5.
I don't think it's 6 months. I think it's shorter than 6 months, but yeah.
Over the next coming updates.
I think the next 3 months are make or break it.
What's coming up in May? Could you talk a little bit about some of the what's some of the highlights of the upcoming changes?
There's a pretty good amount, but one of the first ones we're going to just jump right into is siege weaponry. We've been aware it's been pretty lackluster, basically since shortly after launch. Basically, players have outleveled the damage that most of the
also this prop budget. I just have to say this might be higher than the budget for the test suite of New World in terms of catching bugs.
Can do so. We're doing a pretty good bump to it, increasing the power
at least it
by
feels
around
like
50%,
that. Some of those bugs are really obvious,
and we may end up doing some more buffs down the road. But just doing this little test first to see how it plays out, and then where we go from here. But yeah, buffing pretty much every siege weapon and war, invasion, and outpost rush, and just increasing their damage. The AoEs that are persistent on the ground that do dots are going to last for an extra second. Just get that extra tick in along with the extra damage, and hopefully that'll kind of branch out what's used on the war and invasion forts to just not be a bunch of war horns. And so,
I mean, sure,
trying to mix it up. We're also decreasing.
I mean, the problem with the fire cannons and stuff like that is they tick for 400 to 500 damage, and for reference, most things are ticking for 1k, a little bit under 1k right now. So it's just underwhelming in terms of the damage. It's not about the duration, it's just the damage itself hasn't been scaled to meet expectations of what an AoE's damage is at this point. I think Meteor Shower hits for 1k per tick or something like that, and it's hitting for 400 per tick, and it's lasting less long, and it costs siege parts, which you could use on cleanse pots. There's a lot of other reasons that's not being used, but I guess anything helps.
Increasing the cost of the ammo resupplies so you can refill them a little bit cheaper. It's hoping that kind of mixes up the combat a little bit, makes it feel a little bit more interesting, gives a little bit more diversity to it than just what's currently being used.
I mean, it's helpful, I guess. It's just not enough, in my opinion.
Try out a siege weapon and then hop out again is because I'll just get like focused and you go down so fast because you're kind of like a sitting duck. Is there anything like, are we thinking about anything changes around that?
Not going to be in the same update with all the other stuff, but that's something we're looking into, of trying to see if we can give some sort of like resilience or fortify or something while in it. Potentially long term, we might add some sort of like shields type thing just to make it a little less risky.
That scares me.
Put your head out and be headshotable once you're on those weapons.
Because the instant thing that's going to happen in here is there's going to be a healer with a pocket one of these, and every time they get dove by a kill squad, they're going to put one down and they're just going to hop in it, and you're not going to be able to hit the healer because they're on an elevated surface with a melee weapon. And then you're just going to be stuck in a spot where all you can do is hit them with ranged if they buff it too much. Cool. Like, it's already good for a niche.
That I think happened in
I guess an OPR makes sense though.
Frame was we increased damage a lot, and that has resulted in taunts not being as effective at drawing aggro.
This is PvE.
Changes around that.
Oh yeah, in pretty much most kind of higher level PvE modes.
It might be a 1.25 angle.
DPS has just gone up a lot, and the taunts and threat system didn't really follow. So we're basically just increasing the amount of threat generation that you get from anything that would generate it. So if you have the gem slotted in or anything that would generate more threat, it's just going to be a little bit more powerful. As well,
it also
taunts to melee.
The other thing here that doesn't help too is the previous gear had the ability to have like beloved on your jewelry, and that reduced the amount of threat that you would take as a DPS player, and that never got updated when it increased the gear score. Like, they got rid of that set. So what people do in the higher level run sometimes is they'll still run the 625 set because it only drops your gear score by 5, and you're not able to acquire it really anymore. So you're in a weird spot where it's kind of secluded in terms of like who has what taunt mechanic. You don't want your tanks to do more damage and not really have to focus on as much taunt regen for some things, and they're able to compensate for that by using beloved or something along those lines, and that's something that wasn't present. I think the recent changes to like the amulet that taunts passively have kind of helped with that, but every time you take a taunting kind of passive, you're giving up damage, and for people that are like looking at speedruns, that's like kind of out of the question. Like, you kind of want to have both, not one or the other. For people who aren't focused on speedruns, it doesn't really matter as much, and the taunting will just be helpful overall.
Heavy attacks. Basically, there will be a very brief window, like you're not going to get like an 8-second taunt like you would get with Defender's Resolve, but brief window of taunt to just make sure that you can kind of keep the aggro going, but it'll be enough to kind of like keep it going, but not too much that you can just only rely on taunts to keep the aggro.
Also, just helpful to have people do heavy attacks because they don't do heavy attacks much unless they're trying to break stamina.
More visual update to the whole threat generation and taunt system.
Cool. So let's jump over to artifacts. We're always looking at data for artifacts.
There's only one problem with the taunt thing if you do heavies, is sometimes like DPS players will do heavies in order to break a boss's stamina, and if everyone's doing heavies, the player that does more damage with heavies is going to be the one that pulls taunt aggro, and that might not necessarily be the tank player, but it's probably in the right direction anyway.
In combat in general, looking for kind of trends, and this time around we were looking at the armor artifacts, right? Like, what did we find out there, and what changes did we make?
Yeah, so for this specific one, we're addressing 2 of the artifacts, which are the absolute least used armor artifacts, which are the winged leather shoes and magnetic gauntlets.
This is wild to me, by the way. You just have to stop it here and like look at the artifacts. Like, we have a tier list that we put together a while ago. I could even find a thumbnail for that. Like, if we go back through announcements and like what I thought was terrible at the time or something along those lines, but winged leather shoes I thought was not great, but it wasn't terrible. Okay, this is really, really long ago. Maybe we don't find this. But there's like other artifacts on here that are like, really? You guys these aren't higher priority kind of thing? Like, Gladiator comes to mind. Like, Gladiator has basically no use at all. It's strictly worse than like a round shield in most cases. It's a cool mechanic, but it's just like not really useful. The other one is like, our ghoul gloves. Everyone loves our ghoul gloves. Where are our ghoul gloves on here? Ghoul gloves, they just do nothing. And I have not seen a single player use these, but apparently someone was using them. Winged leather shoes is just the haste one. This is used for like PvE and for gathering, and that's basically it, which I guess is a niche. Mag Gauntlets is weird because it's really used in war and is basically considered to be a must-have in war for IGVG, but IGVG is not very good in OPR because it requires too many conditions to be met for the class itself to be viable to a certain extent. Like for IGVG to be good, you need to have a front line, you need to have healers, which at that point you've exceeded more requirements than is allowable for an OPR spec, because usually you do not have a front line, and you don't always end up with healers. It's like, I'd say like 70% of the time you end up with more than 2 healers on a team. With both of those being a factor, you are just limiting your chances of success pretty drastically, which is why Mad Gauntlets just aren't really used in OPR, and there's just like better builds to play. And because of that, and because Mad Gauntlets are only usable with IGVG right now, is the reason why they're not being used, but it's actually like a relatively good artifact. It's just for one specific spec.
And basically, they were somewhat relatively easily obtainable. So their obtain rate was relatively high, but their usage rate and the unlocking of all the perks on them was relatively low. So for the wing shoes, we're just adding additional functionality, because it used to just be hastes last.
Also, fuck you for saying Mad Gauntlets are easily obtainable. That took me 36 tries to get on that dungeon. I spent 40 minutes in each run on average, and it took me 36 tries. I wasted like 10 hours of my life to get that thing.
Longer, but now
actually maybe more than that.
Damage bonus whenever the hastes are active. So add a little bit more functionality to that. And then the magnetic gauntlets which were the ones that.
But they did fix that later. They made it easier to get.
But your crit damage went down, which kind of interesting play. You got to trigger those on hit
skill issue, pretty much
more often. But the downside of just losing so much crit damage was a pretty high cost and trade-off. So now instead of it being a 50% crit damage reduction, it'll be 30%.
So the obvious thing here is like where you reduce your crit damage by 30% is it basically means this artifact will never be useful for PvP, but it could be useful for PvE. Crit damage, you're never going to have like a crit damage build in PvP that gets to like above a 55% mod, and even at a minus 30, that effectively won't be able to do any additional damage to any player. It's in heavy, and most players in PvP, well, I guess it would do more damage to light players, but it just generally isn't worth building around a, hey, you crit more often, but you generally don't do more damage with your crits build, unless you have something that really, really takes advantage of crits. Examples of that right now, Void Gauntlet's like the easy one, because every time you crit, you gain CDR. The other one that comes to mind that I believe what I've heard is addressed in this video is Spear has this invigorated crits passive, so every time you crit, you gain stamina. So in theory, you could do magnetic gauntlets with Spear. You're able to crit a bunch, you're able to gain stamina a bunch. Use that stamina with a hit from evasive maneuvers to dodge, and you can just basically dodge spam over and over and over again. But other than that, there's not many classes that gain utility off of critting naturally, which is why it's not used a ton.
Okay. Let's move over to a
slight buff for IGVG players to make up for the desync. Kind of. I feel like it's only going to be used in PvE.
To that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so one of the big ones, we got a lot of feedback on this one, so we tried to kind of make equip loads kind of more interesting.
Magnetic gauntlets change literally does literally nothing. Yeah, I don't think it's going to change anything.
Like have those trade-offs, and one thing we did, we adjusted the CC duration status effects, which we heard the feedback. We're going to revert that change, and so it'll go back to where it was, where like.
So this one that they're talking about here, this is if you're in medium right now, there's no change in light. You gain 10% extra duration to CC, which is kind of a lie in terms of how the math actually works, but we'll just ignore that for now. And then heavy was minus 20%, I believe. And they're changing that so that light's 0%, medium is going to reduce CC effects by 10%, and then heavy's going to reduce effects by 20%. So no nut change for heavy, buff to light, buff to medium is the net outcome of that.
It has no reduction, medium has 10%, and then heavy has 20%.
Still think, do you know how many wars
look into more equip loads and
you use magnetic gauntlets on this 35 to 40 runs of Tempest? 0. That's the sad part, because that company, no one has attacked them. There have been 2 wars in the last 3 to 4 months, and in both those wars were stomps in our favor, and because of that, no one's attacked the company.
Previously did. We also heard a lot of feedback about the heavy equip load tower shield.
It was the biggest waste of time I've ever had, but at the time I was an IGVG
we don't want to
player.
adjust actual shields on that, so we're going to just reel in the block stability percentages from 15% to 10% on both heavy and light.
Cool. So moving over to perks. So like we're always looking at perks and like how like how desirable they are. What did we find out? I think Shirking and Power was one that we saw was not being used very, very often.
Yeah, there's a lot of other perks we're going to keep looking at in the future, but Shirking and Power is one. Kind of examine the certain types of categories and exclusive labels on perks. And under the Shirking category, they all have a relatively decent usage across the various types, but Shirking and Power was a little bit lackluster. So especially when you're trying to compete with other things like Shirking Heals. So we're just buffing the Empower you get from that.
Wait, what? Shirking and Power is a completely different slot than Shirking Heals. Shirking and Power goes on Amulet. Shirking Heals is on Armor. You're not competing at all. This is a complete lie. It literally makes no sense. Like, just saying shirking in general? I mean, yeah, if he's talking about, like, I mean, it's not shirking at that point, right? You're talking about, like, stam recovery, basically, is what you're competing against. And it's like, how's this with or versus stam recovery? The trick is if you were a player during a brief period of time, you were able to get this amulet at 680 gear score, which doesn't knock your gear score down by too much, and it gives you stam recovery and shirking and power, and it's great. And then they, removed that. So now only a select player base has this access to this amulet. That's incredibly good for certain situations. That's like high gear score. But yeah, you are competing against like other decent slots. I'd say stam recovery in general has been like less sought after as of recently by like the higher end like PvP community. Instead, people have been opting for stuff like Divine or for just protection. Like generally, you lock in health, you lock in a protection. That last perk is debatable, and usually it goes stem recovery or Divine in most cases. Sometimes you do utility, but shirking and power I think is actually like a relatively good option for a lot of classes that people only don't pick because they don't understand that empower is usually the thing that classes lack in order to do damage. And by running shirking and power with like a build like I'm running right now with Ice Spike, I'm actually able to do a decent amount of damage, and I'm able to hit that empower cap by going Tumbler Feet Wrap with shirking and power, and otherwise I would not be able to do as much damage, and then I have to give up other things. So I don't like completely agree with this, but I don't hate it.
It's going to be 4 stacks of 4%, and it's going to be 3 stacks of 7%. So a little bit easier to get to that full value or the full max amount, and then that max is going to go by about 6.
Okay. Now let's move over to talk about like individual weapon balance updates.
The max is going up by about 6? What does that mean?
Be easier to get to that full value or the full max amount, and then that max is going to go by about 6.
Does that mean the max duration is going up by 6, or does that mean that the max, or does that mean that this is going to be 6 to 10? It's 16% now? Okay. It was 16% before. Oh, that's what they mean. Okay. But isn't that not 6? That means it's going up by 5? Then why do you say 6? I'm so confused why you said 6. Because that would be, it's going up by 5. We were comparing 16 to 21. But it's still a buff, I guess?
Okay. Now let's move over to talk about like individual weapon
Math is hard,
so
I guess.
Bow. Why do you hate bow users, Josh?
That's because I am one. No. Basically, the bow is just a really strong, powerful weapon. It has good strength where you kind of can remain safe and get some really high burst damage while being relatively far away from the normal engagement. But one thing that it kind of is really strong
That's
at
true
right now
in
is it
lower
has
end, but
both
not in
dots,
higher end.
So sustained damage and burst damage from just high damage attacks and just dots being constantly put on them. So we're doing a slight nerf to 2 of the dots.
This is true of OPR. This is completely not true of like more experienced bow players. More experienced bow players basically never touch Poison Shot ever. Poison Shot is terrible. You go Rain, like Rain has a bleed. The bleed's like okay, but that's like not why Rain is used. Rain is used for animation cancels basically only. And then you usually go Explosive and Rapid. Sometimes Pen is used in certain metas too. But like you're not taking like Poison Shot. Like the dots like don't matter really at all for bow. Dots aren't burst. Like they're helpful in situations where there's no healing, but where there's healing, dots are generally not helpful because it's just gonna get passively absorbed by heals that are like AOE heals.
On it, which are the Poison Shot dot and the
it's
Rain of
pad.
Arrows,
Yeah, that's the
So
argument.
we're just kind of reeling in the damage on those just a little bit. Don't want to basically like nerf any weapon to the ground or anything.
I don't hate this though because like Poison Shot and OPR is like incredibly stupid and incredibly toxic, especially in spots where one team has like 2 healers and someone's just tossing like poison shots in the entryways to OPR. Like it's actually so annoying. But I'd say that the fundamental reason why this problem exists is because healers aren't balanced on per team, and it isn't necessarily that bow is strong.
But so the Poison Shot, we're reducing its duration by just a couple seconds because it just has a high damage part. So it's going to be a higher damage, shorter duration, and then Barbed Arrows is going to be a little bit lower damage, longer duration. So Barbed Arrows is being reduced from 15% to 9%, and then keeping its full value or its full duration. And then
so it's even more
Poison
pad
Shot
now.
will be reduced from 10 seconds to 7 seconds. So just a couple ticks on that one.
Okay, so it's just nerfed.
Being too high or kind of mess with the bow's playability.
I don't think any bows hate this because no good bow used this, to be honest. But the OPR bows that are just getting into the game might not like this.
Are not just based on like our gut feeling.
But isn't pad this? If it gets kills, but if pad gets kills, it's no longer pad, it's pressure. There's a fundamental difference there. Firestaff has pressure, bow has pad.
What was the
because Firestaff's dots like actually like create situations where you have to change how you play and like take action from it. Versus bows like it's just like okay, you did a dot to me, like I don't care.
Really high kind of burst damage from just the actual hits that they did.
Like Musket's pressure too.
Dots, especially with a lot of the other artifacts and perks that are coming out that increase the duration of these. And so the bow having both the kind of really high burst damage with just dot ticks that could just keep going. We're just kind of slightly reeling in the dot aspect of it just because other weapons kind of handle that dot thing. Like a Firestaff's a really dot heavy weapon. So don't want the bow to kind of be as powerful as the Firestaff's dot aspect of it. Well,
I mean, the bow, I don't, like, I agree with the sentiment. I don't agree with the reasoning, if that makes sense. Like, I don't think a bow should be like a traditional, like, you don't necessarily need like the poison shot that's doing tons and tons of damage, but like, Firestaff's burns are just so easy to get. Like, they are really, really simple to acquire at any point in time, and that's the frustrating part about Firestaff. Like, any Firestaff ability, like, even autos could apply burns. Any, like, it's just like, it feels like everything the Firestaff does applies a burn, and that burn ticks for similar damage because it stacks and it refreshes to the bow's poison shots, because it has up to 5 stacks, and those 5 stacks are doing like 200, 300 damage per. The bow is ticking for like maybe 500 or 600 right now, I'd say, on live. And that's, that even might be kind of high for 500 or 600. Like, it feels like for meta specs that the Firestaff's doing more with its burns already, and it's easier to acquire those.
Also having the burst damage it has.
Makes sense. Cool. So moving
the
on.
burn damage is absurd. It's not either or. Yeah, like, I would rather them like nerf the Firestaff burn damage. Like, to some extent. But that also could just be because Firestaff's just hitting too hard right now. Like, if you nerf how hard Firestaff is hitting, the burns will hit for less, and Firestaff won't be as nuky, but will still retain like a spot most likely because it's a relatively easy weapon to get into the game. But in my opinion, should have a lower skill ceiling than other weapons because the skill ceiling for the weapon itself is not mechanically difficult.
You want to make there for the next update?
This one is just for the blunderbuss.
Also, Nature's Wrath is like, yeah, that's the problem with Firestaff. Is like, sorry, I keep pausing this and then stopping, but Nature's Wrath is like incredibly, incredibly strong, specifically for Firestaff, because Firestaff's empowers of Nature's Wrath, for instance, is the one that gives you 20% base damage at the cost of all your temporary powers are stripped. Firestaff's empowers from clear casting and clear mind that are inherent to the tree aren't duration associated. Rune of Helios, because it's something that's present on the ground as long as you stand in it, isn't duration associated. The only temporary empower that Firestaff has access to is empowering Meteor Shower, which is like an extra perk they have to slot. So you just like don't do that, and then you just, in theory, deal 20% more damage. It's probably closer to 10 to 15% more damage, but it's still a significant bump in damage for basically no cost for the weapon. And that's the part that is scary, and the reason why Firestaff feels super, super strong right now. I don't think it's necessarily from bugs. I just think it's that artifact works inherently too well with Firestaff because it doesn't strip Clear Mind. It doesn't strip Clear Casting. Like, both of these effects still get value, and then Rune of Helios tends to get value as well. So you still hit that Empower cap, and you get a base damage bonus.
Exhausting net shot. One thing that was just off is the tooltip showed
they could have converted them to Empower Duration and reduce base damage of the weapon.
50%.
Yeah.
So one thing, the tooltip was already misleading, and it showed 10%.
The use of Nature's Wrath is becoming more apparent, especially for Firestaff. It's just like really good for Firestaff.
Perk or status effect. And so we're going to reel that value in just a little bit. So its max value is going to go from 50% to about 41%. Ideally, we still want the perk to be used and have some value, but just not quite as strong, especially with all the bursts that the Blunderbuss does have.
Okay. So what about the Firestaff? Firestaff is actually one of my favorite weapons, and actually I use Flare quite a bit. And I know we reduced the damage of Flare because we thought it was a little too oppressive, especially in like wars and like situations like that. But
Flare has never been used in wars. It will never likely be used in wars because it results in a direct DPS loss of the weapon. And Firestaffs are focusing not. Usually, when you're hitting a clump, you already have so much passive refreshing that you're able to just use abilities. Which is why Flare is just not used, because it's better to use an ability than it is use an auto attack when you're looking for burst.
I guess we've made some changes.
It's not just the Nature's Wrath booms. You're hitting hard with 5 harnessing plus 5 rune glass really and split damage into Firestaff. Yeah, I mean, it's a combination of those things. Sorry, we keep cutting this guy off and I feel bad. But like, if you look at a Firestaff build, like the things that they'll take advantage of is they'll take care of like harnessing like rune glass basically. Could I type this right? Yeah, like fire harnessing. So this is like just plus 2% fire damage. You can only get this on elemental effects. You can't get this on physical effects, which inherently gives Firestaff a major advantage. It's also a reason why some people use the lightning bow, because then you can get the lightning harnessing, for example, which just increases your damage on the bow. Inherently, elemental effects just scale better with damage than physical effects do because of this. And also the gems from Runeglass, like Runeglass cases that are oriented towards like fire or something like that, just inherently are better than the melee ones. Like this is just your fire attacks deal 2% more damage. If you were to like look at a melee oriented one, like I don't even know what it's called, to be honest. Like your attacks deal 1% more damage. And the other thing that's like underlying here that's not talked about as much is I believe the melee attacks have an internal cooldown and the fire attacks don't, if I remember correctly, but I'm going to have to look that up. And that just results in the fire staffs like being able to do better with AoEs. Any basically mage-oriented build, quote-unquote, is just doing more damage with this than any physical one. And the spot where this gets weird is you have a bunch of artifacts that are now causing melee weapons to do different elemental stacks, and then it's basically anything that has an elemental is being meta for some reason because of you could just do more damage with it than physical attacks.
They over-nerfed it a while back. Because it was basically the
flame pots exist though, and lasting consumption makes it last crazy long. Nothing like that exists for thrust, slash, and strike. That is true.
So it went down to 110, and then
that is a valid
now
point.
Bumping that to 120.
But people use conditioning, right?
When we initially put flare in, it was.
And that's how they mitigate versus thrust, slash, and strike.
Style weapon in our data, constantly used, and so we basically got feedback that it felt too strong, so we reeled it back, and then maybe just reeled it back a little bit too far, and so just kind of bumping it up, nudging it. We don't want to do any massive changes like we used to do, where we over nerf or over buff something and then we have to go back and reel it in. So we're just kind of slightly tiptoeing it up to get it to kind of where it feels good.
I mean, I don't hate this though, because flare is not like really used a ton, but like I feel like it's sort of tone deaf because Firestaff is strong, like very, very strong.
And we're looking at those.
Like I'd want to see the Firestaff bug nerfs before I saw that, or during the same patch.
And that's why it's even more important that we do try to fix these as quickly as possible, so we can kind of have a better idea of like what's a real balance issue and what's just a bug that we need to fix. Cool.
That's a fair
So
point.
moving on to flail, what changes do we make for that?
There are so many bugs that affect balance.
One thing we're flail is one of the big feedback we get from it is just the overall flail DPS is relatively low, which was intentional just because it has so much extra utility. Flail is a very versatile weapon. There's so much survivability and there's healing.
Unless her name's Tranquility and you're chasing after me in OPR with some weird one-shot flail combo build that I've never seen before in my life, this is true.
With it, so it's kind of intentional to kind of have it have low DPS, but maybe it's just a little bit too low. So one thing we're doing to kind of work on these little tiptoe balance changes is the leader of the pack passive, which is the one that has kind of a dual purpose. So it initially would do small damage increase if you're by yourself, and then it would give empower to your allies when you were around other allies. And so we're just bumping those numbers up a little bit. So your self-damage when you're alone is going to go up from 10% to 15%, and then the empower, that one's going to go up from 5% to 10%.
Yeah, so this passive wasn't really taken all the time because of this.
The damage. Overall, the flail's utility is kind of, I think, the most important part of it. So we don't want to end up making the DPS so high that we have to nerf some of the other utility aspects of it. So we're going to just keep looking into it and seeing what we can adjust.
Cool. So let's talk about Hatchet.
I think it's a fair starting point, but it could be better.
Keen Berserk, I see on that.
Yeah, that one. So Berserk is just a really useful ability, and then we have some fixes coming in the future. Not sure exactly what release will be a part of, but we're fixing some issues with Berserk stuns and like Hatchet aim throw aspects of it, where like the canceling got weird. But for Berserk, for it being such a useful kind of core foundation of the weapon, the perk usage was pretty non-existent, and most of that was due to the 50% health cutoff, because you don't want to like let yourself get too low health so that you can finally use a perk. So we removed the health condition on it, so it works at any point. And then we adjusted the values and lowered them a little bit, and then adjusted the functionality. So now it's just your overall crit chance and crit damage is going up when you're using Berserk if you have that perk.
I think this is fine.
Health requirement and
it's needed.
The values are going to be a little bit more in control right now. The max will be around 20-ish%.
Cool. So the Musket, we did a lot of rework to the Musket in Season 3, and I know, changing it from hit scan.
Musket's always dangerous.
There were some leftover things that may have like come with that transition, like aiming being one of those. Can you talk about
crit damage too? No, just crit chance.
Yeah. So the Musket is a kind of a hard weapon to balance, mainly just because it's like that kind of difficult to learn But once you master
it's always
like,
buff crit
players
damage?
get absurd with a musket. Like I'll never be as good as most of the players with a musket just because.
I mean, we can go back and look at it, but I think it's
And then
that
the
was
future,
crit
not sure
chance.
exactly what release will be a part of, but we're fixing some issues part of it. So we don't want to end up making the DPS so high that we.
Cool. So
We can
let's
go
talk
look
about
at it
hatchets.
again. You can turn on closed captions too, so you can see it.
The Keen Berserk, I see on that.
Yeah, that one. So Berserk is just a really useful ability, and then we have some fixes coming in the future. Not sure exactly what release will be a part of, but we are fixing some issues with Berserk stuns and like Hatchet aim throw aspects of it, where like the canceling got weird. But for Berserk, for it being such a useful kind of core foundation of the weapon, the perk usage was pretty non-existent, and most of that was due to the 50% health cutoff, because you don't want to like let yourself get too low. And then we adjusted the values and lowered them a little bit, and then adjusted the functionalities.
Oh wait, I skipped over the important part.
And then we adjusted the values and lowered them a little bit. The health condition on it, so it works at any point.
Sorry guys,
And then
skipped
we
the wrong
adjusted
thing.
the values and lowered them a little bit, and then adjusted. And
My
most of that
back
was
is
due to
different
the,
than my forward.
The 50% health cutoff, because you don't want to like let yourself get too low health so that you can finally use a perk. So we removed the health condition on it, so it works at any point. And then we adjusted the values and lowered them a little bit, and then adjusted the functionality. So now it's just your overall crit chance and crit damage.
Okay, it is crit damage too.
Berserk, if you have that.
Yeah, you're right.
There were some leftover things that may have like come with that transition, like aiming.
I mean, we'll see what the values
about
are, but I mean that seems fine to me.
Trying to make it more usable.
Yeah. So the musket
Also,
is
a good PVE buff
kind
too
of a hard
for it.
weapon to balance, mainly just because it's like that kind of difficult to learn. But once you master it, like players get absurd with the musket. Like I'll never be.
Miicrow, want to see what's wrong with Hatchet? I already know.
Way better than me. But the thing we're trying to balance with it is kind of give it more usability without making it too strong or too oppressive in wars. Because
you already know about that one.
With OPR, we were all there in the OPRs where it was just a musket, just kind of ruined.
I want to put it on stream because it's an exploit.
Don't want to make the weapon miserable to use for the people that want to use it. So we are going to remove the accuracy penalty.
Base multiplier is 1.4 in a Hatchet.
That's one of the big usability things. Where
that's going to do damage.
You're accounting for the travel time and the bullet drop. You don't have to worry about
that. Hatchet might be good with that then, in like certain melee situations, which I think would be a welcome change.
We're also doing some kind of usability updates with some of the functionality.
But it's strippable from VG.
Power. Kind of a pretty fun one to use, but yeah, just maybe we wanted to buff it. We redid one of the perks recently for it, and so what the perk did was it added additional pushback, and so we did rework the perk just because it wasn't that desirable in its previous state, and so we're just adding the additional pushback to the base functionality of it. So that'll be right now 3 meters. It'll go up to 5. And then the ultimate on the left tree, I think it was called Deadeye. That one we are going to add a little bit more usability to it. Right now you have to get 2 headshots to proc it, which is pretty heavy condition when you get 2 headshots in a single shot. So now it'll trigger just off hitting 2 targets, which will kind of make it more functionally usable
probably
for
better, but
more players.
I think the stagger part from getting knocked back is going to be kind of disorienting and disruptive, especially because Musket can basically just hit an entire clump and then, or like in an entire line and collapse people, and it will move everyone back. The thing with Musket that's weird right now is it's kind of turned from less of a assassin kind of oriented weapon and more into like a you shoot through the clump and hit a bunch of people and do like a bunch of things kind of weapon, at least in higher levels. Like it's still used to force people out because it's like a relatively hit scan like weapon. It's a projectile now, but still has like basically the longest distance they can consistently hit a target out of any weapon in the game. So you can still use it to pressure individual targets out, but where it really shines on like coordinated PvP is like where you're able to hit like 5 to 10 people with one shot, and you just apply all these debuffs to them. It's like it can get kind of scary, and it's a spot where EU typically has an advantage in wars over NA, and that's a spot where they get a lot of value out of it. OPR, I think it's not as popular as it once was. A lot of those players have definitely quit New World, and I don't know if they'd come back. But it will be interesting to see what happens here.
That barrier to entry a little bit, and then the right tree ultimate, where there was a condition where it only applied to the right tree abilities, and that's just now going to apply to any of the musket abilities.
What's the right tree ultimate, just to have like somewhat of an idea of what they're saying here, because I don't use musket. Oh, lethal combo. So if you hit someone with a trap and you hit someone with a left tree ability, then it will also do increased damage. Okay, that seems like more like a bug than a buff to me in a way. But sure.
Great. All right.
20% damage to all abilities now. It's not to, oh, is it to all abilities? I thought it was all. It's to all abilities affected by the trapper tree's debuffs, though, right? Like you have to hit the debuff into something else. Which I guess is basically all abilities, because stopping power the burn one? Yeah, or it's the slow, right? Yeah, I mean, you can do a stopping power into like other stuff. Oh, I guess powder burn's the slow. But you could do stopping powder, or the burn, but you could use like a stopping powder and a pounding burn and you do more damage. Like, it definitely will hit harder. But I don't think Musket's being used as much, so I don't like hate this. I think the main problem that New World has is that the first weapon that, like, you tell a new player, go play New World, find a weapon that you think is fun and like play it. The first weapon that like 90% of players it feels like they use is the Fire Staff. That's probably an exaggeration. It's probably closer to like 60 to 70%. It's just Fire Staff. Because it just feels really good and it looks really cool and it's really unique compared to other games. And it's like, if you're gonna use a musket, like, you're probably gonna go play like, you know, Call of Duty, or you're gonna go play like Sniper Elite or something like that. Like, you know, like, it's not like a traditional thing that people usually use. So I don't know if people are like typically oriented towards it. And then like with MMO players, like, I don't think as many people like want to be like a musket main in certain situations too. Like, I think there's like a background aspect that makes it like less desirable as well. It's not just a like how good is it kind of thing. You also, typically musket builds are usually lower con and are less forgiving as well.
What about the Rapier?
Fire Staff is hell to level with because you struggle with mana early on. Yeah, that's true.
Really useful to use in many different situations.
But it looks cool.
One feedback we got,
usually, like, if you want to optimize, you do a melee weapon so you're higher level.
Really one of the most
and get enough stats
kind of
to get 200.
Abilities, but was one of the least used perks for it. It was a deadly flourish perk. Right now it just does a damage boost, which
I talked about changing that a few months back.
Like,
yeah, I know they did in terms of the mana stuff.
Strong. So one thing we're adding to it is that part will still be there, but now it's going to also apply the Rapier bleed with that perk, and that'll just help.
It's just going to make this insane.
The finish aspect of it a little bit easier, let you get bleed stacked a little bit easier.
This is going to change the PvE meta. Now everyone's going to run the same thing. Is the only problem. If we go to, where's my Rapier? Why can't I just see Rapier? It's right in front of me. But like, people were running Tondo and Flourish and Finish and Flurry before for PvE. Like, I think it's just going to be Flourish and Finish, Flurry and Evade now. So you can get the damage bonus from Evade. And then like, your Flourish and Finish basically has the bonus from Tondo already on there. There's no reason to really run Tondo at a certain point here. Because I don't think you can animation cancel it as well as you used to be able to in the past. So it's probably just going to be Flourish, Finish, Flurry, because Flurry is a really good ability. And then Evade for PvE. PvP will be not as, like, I think it will be used, but I don't think it's like as big of a deal. Like, I think this is gonna hit for like, you know, 6-7k as a burst combo. So is it gonna be used? Well, hell yeah. And maybe we'll stop getting bows running around with hatchets all the time and we'll start using rapiers again. But I don't think it will be as influential as it will be with PvE. And then PvE, I think, is just gonna take over by storm and make Rapier maybe even better than it is right now in PvE, which it's already like one of the best weapons, if not like considered to be like the best single target DPS weapon in most circumstances in PvE, at least from what I understand. So all hell Rapier, I guess.
Cool. And what about the spear? I see we got quite a few changes coming in for that as well.
Just dyed my hair for the first time today. I can't relate, but congratulations. Hope it came out well.
Hopefully not enough to make it feel miserable. I love the spear. It's a fun weapon to use, but some of the kind of utility it had, because it had really high DPS and just a ton of utility. So one that we're going to change is for the evasive maneuvers passive. Right now that applies to all dodges for 2 seconds, and we're going to make it the next dodge with 2 seconds. I think that's still enough to make it feel useful, have some really good value, just not be like too strong. And then that combined with the invigorating crits
I think
passive,
that's better.
that right now is you just get flat stamina on a crit, which is incredibly powerful because it can apply to like Cyclone and just every other hit. So instead of it just giving you flat damage, it's going to give you.
Are they addressing Cyclone too? Then I'd assume they address Cyclone too. If they're talking about with the
hopefully enough to keep its value.
They're not
going to maintain its purpose, but not become that thing where you never have to worry about stamina. And then the fortifying perforate perk.
Nope.
Perforate does a lot. It's a
think.
good ability. It does have damage, and then
I would have talked about it there. They're addressing it.
One we're going to initially look at is
I think Flintlock is confirmed as next weapon with that fat centerpiece.
Hopefully enough to make it useful, but not oppressive or not too powerful. That's kind of our main goal, is we want most things to have a purpose and have a value, but just not make it.
I feel like it's not worth speculating anymore, because we've had daggers in game and data mine for multiple years and they just haven't come out.
Cool. And so you talked a little bit about this.
They didn't nerf the spear Cyclone. That's crazy. Cyclone is really, really good for spear. It's not used for every single tree, to be fair. There's like a few different ways to build spear. This is kind of like one of the trees that people go that's like a more DPS oriented. And there's a CC one with a Scorpion Sting where people go like jab, sweep, vault kick for a cheese combo, and for that you can't run Cyclone. But Cyclone just gives flat 25 stam per hit. I use spear as a tank sometimes because this is so strong. Like, I will just use Cyclone just to gain a full stand bar when my shield goes down. And I think I'm one of the only people that's ever used spear that way as a tank. but it is very good for that. And it's definitely one of the strongest reasons to use Spear, as well as this does strike damage, so it typically gets around people's resistances, because everything else is like thrust damage, right? Like, I guess Sweep's initial hit is strike, and then it follows up with thrust, but and Vault Kick's damage isn't really significant because it scales at 75%. But Cyclone's scaling at 165% strike damage, and strike being the damage type in the game that's probably the least used is what makes that really strong. I think Invigorating Crits and Evasive Maneuvers are the strongest parts of Spear right now as a whole, and that's a good way to like nerf it as a start. This will put Spear in an interesting spot where it can't just dodge spam out of everything to live. So we might get back into a spot where I don't really want to say this 100% accuracy, but a BB could be used as a decent tool versus Spear, assuming it still has somewhat decent base damage at this point, because it could just blow up the Spear, but that can't dodge and it's in his face. Ice Spike is a tool that can be used decently versus Spear. I'm naming like off-meta stuff first. If I'm being realistic here, it's going to get deleted by Firestaff, because Firestaff is just really, really strong. But we'll see if where this lies. You can run Spear and Heavy still. It's interesting that they haven't talked about SNS yet, because it's used with Spear a lot to close distance, and is one of the reasons why Heavy is viable right now.
Kind of like what we were seeing in the data with the Spear.
Game definitely needs more ranged.
Sure
oh boy, please no.
It was at the top of the list in most modes.
Every OPR game is 15 ranged on each side and 5 melee players, and I'm running around trying to figure out what's going on. Or it'll be like 10 ranged and like 5 like random one-shot builds.
Kind of main ones are data focused. In most modes, the Spear was kind of like either in the most used or most damage events triggered. Even weirdly, sometimes most damage done.
That is weird.
Combined with just all these extra effects it had, which. Granted, Spear, I think it's main.
Honestly, that might just because of Jordan, because he's playing Spear on the same server as the
so
devs.
Kind of looking into adjusting the.
Almost every ability in the game sees widespread uses besides maybe like Execute, Incinerate, Evade Shot, Mighty Gavel, Mortar, Windchill. Even Execute I see used a decent amount nowadays.
The other weapons.
Cool.
But yeah.
That brings us to the Sword and Shield. This one, these changes might be a little controversial because, as I'm sure everyone knows, the Sword and Shield is very strong and very well used, but we're actually suggesting some buffs here. Can you tell
No, what? Really?
Yeah, so like you said, really controversial. Sword and Shield is a very versatile weapon in terms of its functionality, but
I think it's too strong in terms of tanking right now.
PvP mode with a weapon, you're going to just see 3 abilities used every single time, and so we want to kind of buff the other things to kind of give you a little more choices and kind of make
fuck you guys. I played as a tank too.
Get a little bit of a buff, so we're improving the taunt that it has, kind of changing how quickly it activates. So the stacker
what?
A little bit more.
I thought they're talking about PvP.
Abilities used every single time, and so we want to in a PvP mode with a weapon. You're going to just see 3 abilities used every single time, and so we want to kind of buff the other things to kind of give you a little bit more choices. And
you can't taunt in PvP.
So Defender's Resolve is going to get a little bit of a buff, so we're improving the taunt that it has, kind of changing how quickly it activates. So the status effect that's applied when you activate Defender's Resolve is going to be activated a little bit sooner. The cooldown we're reducing a little bit, not too much, because that survivability you get from it's going to be strong, but trying to hope that we can kind of keep its value going and give it a little bit more purpose outside of the 3 abilities that most people use.
It does have a 45-second cooldown, which is really nice to reduce.
We're also increasing the final upgrade to Defender's Resolve. The healing there right now, it's max health, and we're going to change it to base health. So instead of it being 15% max, it'll be 30% base, and kind of open up the amount of equip loads and different builds that upgrade will be ussul with. And then Whirling Blade, we're doing a change there. Whirling Blade's a hard one just because it does kind of compete with the final attack in the light attack chain. So we're increasing the radius to just make it, if you're in a crowd,
at the same time I didn't really use it
with Whirling Blade. And then maybe down the road we'll look into kind of how to improve Whirling Blade's value a little bit more.
Whirling Blade, in theory, is one of the strongest abilities in the game if you could hit multiple targets with it. I believe if you hit 5 targets with it, it scales at like somewhere between like 210 and 220 base damage, which is the highest of any single ability in the entire game, which is not consistently easy to do. It'll be crazy if someone figures out a way to make that build work, and if they do figure out a way to make that build work, it is going to hit people for like probably a solid like 10 to 15k. I think if the stars align and they did everything possible to increase the damage, realistically probably closer to like 6 to 8k. But it's definitely going to hit hard. Maybe like 1 billion. I don't think it will one-tap. It's kind of hard to one-tap people when your average like melee player has like 24k HP. But yeah, it's going to hit hard.
And I noticed there's a missing ability from this list, which is Reverse Stab. So
Yes.
what are we planning for that one?
That was intentionally left out because in our next upcoming balance patches, we're not going to do anything with reverse stab. But down the road a little bit, we're actually going to just rework it entirely. We'll probably keep a lot of the similar like upgrade functionality and stuff, but
it's not
just a
immediate
better
though.
animation, make it easier to hit, and excited to see how you guys respond to it once you can finally see what it'll turn into.
Yeah, we think that was one of the main reasons why it was a lesser used ability.
Yeah, it
right?
is hard to hit
the long
in certain
weapon.
spots.
It didn't seem very usable in a lot of different PvP scenarios.
Yeah. Even just thematically.
Defender's Resolve is.
I'm going to turn around.
I mean, it'll be interesting. I don't think it's going to get used a ton in terms of tanking.
But yeah, it just didn't
still
really fit well.
But it'll still be used.
Just wasn't that appealing of an ability, even though functionally it had some pretty good upgrades. And
so all you reverse stab lovers, get your usages in now while you still can.
Both of you.
Yeah. Okay, and then the last weapon that we wanted to talk about for this update is the Warhammer. So what changes were made there?
Yeah, Warhammer. That's a good kind of a similar to the sword and shield, where for the most
reverse stab will hit someone behind you.
Trying to buff the other ones to kind of make them more value. Kind of it's one that's happening a lot is Mighty Gavel. We're just increasing its damage from 170 to 190.
I think it's just
and
hard
then
to hit.
The upgrade to check for your target's health. That's going to be bumped from 130 to 150 to just give it more damage.
And sure, it's just
Warhammer
that
right
ability
now,
is really hard to hit.
Really strong with CC, so if you can stagger stun them, it's fantastic. But then its normal abilities don't quite have that similar value. So just bumping up damage on that ability, kind of give it a little bit more purpose.
I mean, it's a simple thing. It doesn't involve an animation team, I guess.
We covered a lot of weapons here, but there are some that we didn't cover. Do you want to talk about just like the reasoning why some of these weren't touched in this update?
Yeah, Great Axe, that one in Season 5, as you also saw the artifact, probably one of the most fun artifacts I've used so far.
They completed it?
That is going to give a lot more value to Whirlwind.
If they completed that, that means the devs were able to beat the raid. I'm actually genuinely impressed. Like, some players can't even beat the raid.
And then we also buffed the base Whirlwind functionality a little bit when you don't have the artifact.
Assuming they actually have it upgraded.
Win, but then if you have the artifact, you get all the cool spins. But then without it, it still felt pretty lackluster. So we buffed that, and we want to kind of see how that, just the overall weapon changes play out just for that one. Like once we change that one ability, because that'll change up how you can chase, potentially how much damage you do, how you get away from fights. Yeah, and so we're going to see how that one plays out.
Yeah, no, the damage is a scam because it scales at like 0% damage, basically. Like, the thing just will never be able to do damage, even if you max out and empower and like have infinite base damage, basically, because it's original scaling. Where is my Great Axe? But Whirlwind scales at 50% weapon damage, meaning it like hits like half as hard as like an auto attack. And because that 50% multiplies by everything, if you wanted to do as much damage as auto attack, you would need to have like a 200% multiplier and something else, like a 2.0 multiplier and something else to compensate for that, which effectively makes it like useless in terms of doing damage for the most part. I've seen it hit me for like 700 to 800 damage, which I guess is like something, but like it's kind of just like you just sit there and you just laugh at the guy and just set up for some sort of combo because it doesn't really do that much. But it at least looks cute, and it's a fun ability.
Wood Gauntlet's another one. That one is one that's
they're taking my 7.5k damage reduction down to 2.4k heal. Yeah,
kind of spending time working on the bug functionality aspect of it, and then
the heal thing is ridiculous. Like in terms of a nerf,
more damage. And so yeah, kind of like
it also has a long cooldown. Like we'll have to see like
did that before we just start like diving into the balance, especially since
it's Defender's Resolve. Defender's Resolve is getting nerfed, in my opinion. I think they're calling it like a rework or a buff. In my opinion, I call that a nerf for the most part. So like this healed off of your max health before. It's gonna heal off at 30% of your base health. To be honest, at that point, I don't know if I'd even take it. Like, I'd probably just go into these two, and, like, I would ignore Restoration, because it's just not going to heal for that much. Because your base health is, like, 8,024, so it's always going to heal for 2.4k. And a 2.4k heal, while it's nice, like, the cooldown would need to be pretty low for that to be useful. I mean, the damage reduction part is, like, the best part about this, though. Like, by far, it's, like, not the heal, but, like, that is strictly a nerf in terms of the heal. Like, I don't know if they're being super clear about that, but that is strictly a nerf for, like, basically every build in the game. The only build in the game where that, like, wouldn't be a nerf is, like, builds that are running between, like, maybe 5 and 100 con, and even then, if you're at 100 con, I'm pretty sure it's still a nerf, because of the way that base health works in the game, so, yeah, I would not be excited to use Defender's Resolve. I would say that's probably still not going to be used, and you're just going to see Leaping, Bash, and Rush still. Maybe a little bit of Whirling Blade. The one spot where Resolve has some values, if you use it before you go in super deep, and you're getting a bunch of damage taken because you can reduce that damage like altogether, but it's not uber significant. Yeah, why do they keep ruining perks with base health? I don't know, but base health is 80-24. Most people have like 3 times that in terms of like actual health, and it's the reason why when something has base health, it doesn't heal for like anything basically. Where are the patch notes? I don't believe they're out yet.
In a previous update,
actually,
I think they come out tomorrow.
Because I forgot to mention this. Yeah, Void. So the life taker artifact that was
because they view base health as works for all classes, low con or high con. Yeah, I guess, but if you're high con, you're just not going to use something that goes up at base health.
And it was like going around.
They killed 5 cons, so now they killed 500 con. Shield blocking and I mean, people didn't really run that, to be honest. It wasn't a run ability.
It will be turned back on.
Like I ran it a little bit on this patch because Firestaff is so strong, but it doesn't really matter.
Lifestaff is kind of a hard one to balance because depending on the mode and the situation, it's like simultaneously overpowered and underpowered depending on when and where and who's using it. And
is Lifestaff ever underpowered? Like, I'm trying to think of a spot where Lifestaff is underpowered. I think it's very strong in duels. I think it's very strong in 3v3. I think it's very strong in OPR, and it's a must-have in war. Like, I think it's the highest class win rate in OPR off of those old stats that we got. I don't know of a single spot where I'd say Lifestaff is underpowered, but that's mostly because there's nothing else that can compete with the healing it does. He said depending on who is using it. I mean, that is fair. I think if you are newer to Lifestaff, you generally get less value with it by like a long shot because of weird intricacies and bugs. Like the thing with Lifestaff that's fundamentally like broken about it is if you break LOS when you're scrolling between targets, like assuming you're a normal player and you don't have the keybind set up because you haven't figured out that it's necessary for New World to heal properly, then if you scroll between targets and you break LOS, the heal just won't go off and it won't heal for anything, which causes like Lifestaff to like not really be as consistent as you would hope, and it's like a reason why a lot of stuff just doesn't go through. But like once you fix the key bindings, it's like it's okay.
So we've talked about this in a previous video, but we do want to kind of update the trees.
You watched the part where they nerfed the net shot perk? When was that? I think we were talking and I kind of missed it.
In a really interesting way. And so we didn't do any balance updates, so we could, in the future, look into kind of reworking the trees. And then Ice Gauntlet was a final weapon that we haven't talked about. Actually, well, Ice Gauntlet and Great Sword, but Ice Gauntlet
they
was a
nerfed
bug
exhaust
that
in
we're
that shot, right?
now about the cooldown reduction. Entomb is triggering multiple instances of it. Kind of going to fix that, and then we did some other balance updates with it recently.
My Ice Spike build.
Going to keep doing some examining because Ice Gauntlet's one of those weapons that has a lot of utility. Damage is kind of lackluster because of that usability, and we just want to kind of keep examining it before we keep making any
my Ice Spike make the damage good again.
Great Sword, final one. Great Sword's really strong, really useful weapon.
Just telling Crush these idiots that the BB had burst damage. BB doesn't have burst damage right now really at all.
Artifact for the Great Sword Serenity is kind of in that state where it feels like it's kind of the must use. You probably should be using that artifact.
Yes, that is
fair.
Trying
to examine what we can do to
make the Serenity.
Give a little bit more diversity to like what item or which.
If we look at BB though, like, oh god, I think it's best just to look at every single weapon. Like, what weapon does BB deal more damage than? I don't think. Well, okay, BB does slightly more damage than Flail unless you have the weird tree that involves Arcane Eruption that I've only seen once or twice ever used in my life. It does less damage than Great Sword at this point. I think it technically does more burst than Sword, but Sword has so much more utility, it doesn't really matter. It does less damage than Rapier. If you build the Rapier right, it does less damage than Firestaff. Lifestaff, we don't really need to talk about. It does less damage than Bow, less damage than Warhammer, less damage than Musket, less damage than Hatchet. Probably a little bit more damage than Great Axe, usually. Some Great Axe trees, no. Does a little bit more damage than Ice Gauntlet unless you're using Spike, in which case I think Spike does more burst than Blunderbuss now. Void Gauntlet, it should do more damage than Void Gauntlet, but if you're going Tether with Void Gauntlet, you can do more damage than Blunderbuss, and Spear does more damage than Blunderbuss. Like, I think Blunderbuss, like, inherently is very, very weak right now because there were bugs in the past that basically caused BB to do more damage than was intended, and when those bugs were patched, BB was never buffed in compensation, and because of that, BB is in a spot where it's strictly used as a util role. We have bugs in the game like I would argue this is a bug. I don't believe the dev sick this is a bug. I argue this is a bug where Apparatus's like extension is not slowed inherently by freedom. So then you can do like Apparatus 7 seconds slow for 50% and to double down, which will reduce your cooldown of your next ability by 50%. This is a 20-second cooldown. It goes on in 10 seconds. So you can basically, with a little bit of like refreshing, which you get passively from future planning, you can just go net shot and a net shot. And that's like the main reason why BB's used so much in OPR, and other than that, I don't really see BB get used too much. The slow is a bug, 100%. Maybe. But yeah, like I would argue that should be a bug and should be fixed, but at this point, I'm less sure that they think this is a bug. And if they fix that along with the other effects that Freedom like passively just makes better, that makes the game like less fun, then I think BB would be easily in a spot where you're just like, okay, BB's not being used at all because its utility sucks and its damage sucks. We need to buff something. Let's buff its damage. Like, but inherently a shotgun that hits less harder than like a flail is, well, I guess usually hits a little bit harder than a flail, but like it's a shotgun and it hits less hard than like most other weapons, and it has to be close quarters. Like it inherently doesn't have a lot of strengths that it's playing towards, and it's frustrating because I feel like this weapon needs to be buffed, but most players, like from an OPR standpoint, will think this weapon is really strong because they'll just get hit from exhaustive net shot or just from net shot in general with apparatus, and like it's not fun to play versus. Like it's a combination of like really not fun to play versus, but doesn't do a lot assuming that you know how to play versus it. Like BB, for example, was slotted like pretty consistently as a 2 to 6 of within NA for wars within the first year and a half in New World. Ever since the patch where they changed the gems and how int gems work, BB has never been slotted in wars. And while wars I don't think is like the best metric for anything, I would say wars is a pretty good metric for like how optimized builds typically are used in terms of like looking at optimization overall. It's been used a little bit with Firestaff for some like basically bug utility reasons with Pestilence, but other than that, like it's not really ever been used for damage. Like people are going like net shot, like going in a claw shot somewhat, and then going for like blast shot, just taking random passives, and like it doesn't really matter what you take at a certain point. Like it just doesn't do that much. Like I don't know. I think BB needs buffs, but I might be in the minority.
The great sword you're going to be using, and so yeah, just looking into that. But it is just overall a great sword. It's like a pretty strong weapon, pretty useful.
Yeah, I mean they could just adjust the PvP modifier, and I think BB would be a lot better in PvP
definitely a lot to look
because it's being nerfed still for some reason.
Update. And that brings us to our community question. So what we'd like to know is actually of those weapons that we didn't cover in this upcoming update. What would you most like to see with those weapons? Don't forget to like and subscribe, and please let us know in the comments what you.
I mean, I don't think a community question really matters that much. Like, I guess my closing thoughts of this is like, I don't know. I don't think it's a super impactful thing, but it's nice to hear something. Like, this is the first time we've heard this team talk about balance. I would argue that they're kind of missing the mark on a few things, or like most things, but at least they talked about it, I guess. Like, I prefer Dave's style still a little bit, because Dave was like pretty direct with like, hey, we're buffing this, hey, we're nerfing this, this is why, and that was basically it. But I don't like the whole, we looked at the data and the data said this, so we're gonna do this. Because whenever like they say we looked at the data, it feels like excuses to me. Like whenever I look at like Overwatch, for example, do a balance patch or something like that, they will show like usage statistics and like win rates of every single hero, and then like they'll use that data to make informed decisions. And like they actually like show the data like to the players, you know, like versus this is like, oh, we looked at the data and the data's like sort of in air quotes and there's no like infographic for it. So it's like a little bit harder to follow, but and harder to trust, to be honest, because I don't think the trust aspect's really there, but we'll see. I miss Dave. I hope Dave's doing well. I do kind of miss Dave too, to be honest. Dave generally I think was on the spot except for like Firestaff stuff. I thought Dave was pretty good. And the Firestaff stuff was still cool. It's just like I think it was that Firestaff has been a little bit overtuned for like the last year. Like I think it's doing like maybe 10 to 20% more damage than it probably should be able to do. But the whole idea of like why Firestaff was needed to do more damage is because Firestaff didn't have utility. Now Firestaff sort of has utility in terms of the burn stacking. I wouldn't say it's like insane utility, but it's utility. So I'd rather they just fix the exploits. I mean, yeah, I think they're going to be doing that. They just aren't mentioning like every single exploit in there. We'll see what they fix. this is like a starting spot in terms of stuff that's in red. I think will likely be fixed, but I'm not 100% sure on, because I think AGS saw this list at some point. At some point I saw 30 people on here. I assume some of those people were like AGS, like 30 to 50 people on here for like one day at some point. So we'll see what gets addressed from this list. Like, I don't think this is a perfect list, but it's at least a starting point, and they have like other reports that people have sent in as well. So I don't know. I wouldn't really say I'm optimistic, but that was a developer update for sure. Like, I would have been a little bit more sold with some other things, and I feel like some of the nerfs they did, it's kind of just like, why? Like, why is SNS getting nerfed? I don't think they even necessarily view it as a nerf, but it's pretty clear that they don't. I mean, this is being detail-oriented, but it's pretty clear that they don't completely play their game, or at least they're nervous when they're talking about, like, shirking Empower competing for shirking heals, when shirking heals, like, you know, doesn't compete for shirking Empower.